Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarev II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our U.S. Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of November 19th, 2023. Today, we have a fascinating cross-cultural discussion for you about East Asia and the state of scientific and technological advancement in East Asian countries, as well as perceptions of science, technology, and transhumanism in a part of the world that has increasingly affected all of human civilization for the past several decades especially. And our distinguished panel today includes our 2024 U.S. Vice Presidential Candidate and Director of Community and Citizen Science, Daniel Tweed, as well as our Legislative Director, Jason Geringer. And our guest of honor today is our Vice Chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party, who had been our Vice Chairman between June 2020 and February 2023, and per our rotation again became Vice Chairman this month through January 2024. He is Arin Vahanian. He is a technologist, author, entrepreneur, musician, blogger, startup advisor, and aspiring entrepreneur. He has worked for 3 Fortune 100 companies and several technology startups. He helps organizations build high-performance teams and create and launch products and services that delight the customers. Being deeply devoted to the promise of transhumanism and the concept of continuous improvement, Arin is the author of a book called Kaizen for Men that combines self-help with lean manufacturing and Toyota production principles, helping men boost their career, health, and relationships. He became interested in the transhumanist movement after coming across various life-changing technologies and breakthroughs in the medical field. His personal vision is to live and love deeply, being dedicated to building and spreading technologies that allow human beings to live more fulfilling, joyful, and enhanced lives. And specifically, he has an interest in curing mental health disorders such as depression and social anxiety disorder, as well as reversing aging and curing dementia and other neurological disorders. He has written about these subjects on the U.S. Transhumanist Party website. I encourage you to check out his articles there. He holds a bachelor's degree in journalism, in public relations, and a Master of Business Administration, specializing in management from California State University in Northridge. Additionally, he holds several professional certifications in the information technology industry, is a certified project management professional, a certified Lean Six Sigma Green Belt, and an enrolled agent. And I must add, a wonderful human being all around, who has been a great help to the U.S. Transhumanist Party ever since 2018. So he has been with us for 5.5 years now. Arin, welcome to our salon today. We are pleased to have you. And I wanted to ask you to tell us more about your recent trip to East Asia. Where did you go? What were your impressions? We'll start with that, and then we'll delve into some more specific areas as we proceed.
Thank you so much, Gennady, for the amazingly kind words. I am indebted to you and the whole organization. And it's an honor and a pleasure to be here today with all of you to discuss something that I care very much about and has been a part of my life. So again, thank you so much to everyone for joining today. It's a real pleasure for me. Yes, it is true. This year, I was able to take a couple of trips. During COVID, I wasn't really able to go anywhere, just like many of you, right? And so it was indeed a delight this year to be able to go to 2 of my favorite places on earth, China and Japan. I went to China over the summer, and just the other day, I returned from a trip to Japan. East Asia is a place that I love very deeply. I've spent a total of, I've lived in East Asia for about 9 years and have done multiple trips over there. It's a place that has played a very important role in my development as a human being. And I'm also deeply fascinated by certain aspects of East Asian culture, now whether it's Japan or it's China or it's South Korea, and in particular, the Confucian countries. Not limited to those, of course, but in particular those.
Excellent. Well, it seems that, especially today, given their very different historical pathways, Japan and China would have some significant differences in culture as well as their approaches toward science and technology. Japan modernized very rapidly, starting with the Meiji Reformation in the 1870s. But then, of course, going into World War II, there was a period of great disruption and discontinuity because the authoritarian regime there turned away from material progress toward more of a conquest mentality. But then after World War II, after the defeat of Japan, it seems because there was no path forward along these militaristic lines, the society very quickly reoriented itself toward civilian production, toward economic development, toward increasing standards of living. China, on the other hand, faced a long history between about the 1840s and the 1940s of kind of internal fracturing. There were some colonial influences. There was a major civil war, the Taiping Rebellion. Then there was a period of warlordism in the early 20th century. And then Mao took over in 1948. We had the Cultural Revolution, which wasn't conducive to progress, but then Deng Xiaoping really turned things around, starting in the late 1970s, kind of inaugurating this period of great material progress that has happened in China since that time. So how did you observe these kinds of historical influences in those countries today, and which ones are the most salient? And do you think they've led to similar results or very different results in your observation?
Thanks for that, Gennady. That you brought up some very, very interesting points there, and it's very obvious you have a very firm grasp of East Asian history. So I'm very impressed. Not that I would expect any less from you. So yes, you are correct. Japan and China are very different in some areas. In other areas, they're very alike, right? And I think it's very important for us, especially those of us in the West, to go back a little bit and study this. As you know, both Japan and China are heavily influenced by Confucianism, and the Japanese writing system, or at least part of it, is what was taken from China. Of course, it's Chinese characters, right? And of course, Japan has some other characters that they came up with themselves, and South Korea, up until recently, was using mainly Chinese characters. So yes, there's a lot of similarities in the two countries, China and Japan. And I'll try to comment a little bit about South Korea. I just don't know very much about South Korea in comparison to Japan and China, so I'll probably focus more on those. But it does behoove us, especially those of us in the West, to study this history of these countries. But yes, there are definitely a lot of similarities. There are a lot of differences too. As you're saying, Japan modernized first, and then unfortunately things took a rather ugly turn with their militarism, and then the disaster of World War II for Japan. On the other hand, China struggled in different ways, right, with events such as the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward, which ironically wasn't a great leap forward, but rather a great leap backward. But credit to both countries, they recovered from these disasters, right? Japan recovered from the disaster of militarism and World War II. China recovered from the disaster of the Cultural Revolution, among other things. And both of them have achieved incredible progress since their lowest points, right? And no country has modernized faster than China. What we've seen in the last few decades that China's done, no other country has ever done this. Not Japan. It took Japan longer. Not the U.S. It took the U.S. longer. What China's been able to accomplish over the last few decades is nothing short of breathtaking, right? Despite what we hear, in the media in the West, right? So both countries have achieved incredible modernization and progress and development in a short amount of time. And it's interesting when you read works such as The Toyota Production System by Taiichi Ono, founder of the Toyota Production System. Mr. Ono said, our development happened as a result of necessity. After World War II, the country was destroyed. The country was in ruin. We had no choice. We had to progress. We had to develop, and we had to do it in a very, very fast way, right? And then in terms of China, you mentioned Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping made a comment, and I won't quote it verbatim because I don't remember it verbatim. I have it in my book, but if anyone's interested in checking out Kaizen for Men, but Deng Xiaoping basically said, we have to admit that we're behind, and we have to admit that we need to improve. And this really kicked off a series of events whereby China, since the late 70s, right, after Mao Zedong passed away and Deng Xiaoping took power, they achieved incredible progress. We've never seen this kind of progress before in such a short period of time. So it's really important for us, especially those of us in the West, to study these events and see how we could achieve such development. Now, you might say, well, the West is already developed. Yes, but that doesn't mean that we can't improve, right? That doesn't mean we can't learn stuff from other countries and other cultures.
Yes, absolutely. And by the way, I do encourage everyone to check out Kaizen for Men. It's a great book, a short read, but definitely contains some highly effective advice and generally good frameworks for thinking about various areas of life. Now, I definitely agree that the pace of progress for China since Deng Xiaoping came to power has been phenomenal. And China, since that time, was transformed from being essentially an economically struggling country under Mao with the Great Leap Backward, let's call it, to a country that supplies a lot of the goods that we rely on, a lot of the manufactured goods, a lot of technological goods, and it has contributed to significant increases in standards of living for people in the Western world. John H. makes an interesting observation that China has adopted many of the elements of capitalism while still clinging to the label communist. And Luis Arroyo points out that this was so, especially after Mao's death. Now, would you characterize China today as a predominantly capitalist society? And if that is the case, why do you think the Communist Party still clings to the communist label? Because I think that could be a bit confusing to Western observers, given the stereotypical views of communism as essentially government-owned means of production, central planning, no room for private initiative or private enterprise, yet there's plenty of private enterprise in China. They have large corporations that behave in a very capitalistic way. So how would you characterize China in terms of it being capitalist or communist? Is it really communist at all anymore?
I love this discussion. Thank you for bringing this up. I'll start my answer with sharing a joke with you. There's an old joke whereby Deng Xiaoping is in a car with his driver, and they reach a fork in the road, and there's two signs. The sign on the left says communism. The sign on the right says capitalism. And the driver asks him, boss, what should I do? Deng Xiaoping said, signal left, but turn right. And I think that's really, it really helps us to understand better the system in China right now. there hasn't ever been a system like this before, right? Gennady, you're quite familiar with communism, right? Given your background, I'm Armenian. I'm pretty familiar with communism as well. And so, you and I, and I'm sure many others on this call, have an understanding of communism and the way it was practiced before, right? And the system in China now, it's important to say that we've never seen such a system before, right? We've never seen something like this. It's more of a hybrid. It certainly has a lot of capitalistic elements. It also has some elements that those of us in the West are not that familiar with, right? And or maybe not even that comfortable with. I'll just give an example. Chinese people, by and large, are more comfortable with certain things that we might not be as comfortable with in the West. I'll just give you an example. In many Chinese cities, there's a lot of cameras, whether they're speed cameras, whether they're cameras on the street. And again, I'm not speaking for the entire populace of China, but just that culturally, they're more comfortable with this sort of, I don't know, I'll use the term surveillance, and many people will be uncomfortable with that. But many people over there are more open to such things than we might be in the West. Additionally, the government there, Chinese people have a different relationship with their government than we do in the West. The government in China is kind of a father figure, for lack of a better term, right? And if you look at China historically and culturally, it's been that way for a long time, right? It's been that way for a very, very long time. And even Japan in the past, right? There were shoguns and all this kind of stuff, right? So not anymore, of course, but such countries have a different historical development than us, right? And they've historically have had a different relationship with their government. Now, you might say that maybe you might not be comfortable with this, and I say by you, I mean the people in the West, right? We might not be comfortable with this. On the other hand, some of us might be, right? But the lesson is that they have a different system, they have a different history, they have a different cultural background, and the relationship between the government and the populace in other countries, especially in East Asia, is different from the relationship that we have in the West, right? So it's important to point that out. Now, to go back to your question of, is China capitalist or communist? Well, I would say it's certainly more capitalist than it is communist. It's not communist in the sense that the USSR was, right? Definitely not. And one of the things that was important for Deng Xiaoping and other people in the Chinese government was they studied what happened in the USSR and made great efforts to ensure that what happened to the Soviet Union wouldn't happen to China, right? And I think one of the most important things was that China decided that it had to develop economically before developing politically, right? Whereas in the USSR, it was kind of the opposite. And so China studied what happened in the USSR quite carefully to ensure that that wouldn't happen to China. And I think it's pretty clear that, at least economically, China's far more successful than the USSR ever was, right? And furthermore, is far more flexible, right? You've seen events like the Great Leap Forward, the Tiananmen Square incident, and even recently with zero COVID, the Chinese government has an uncanny ability to rebound from mistakes it makes, right? It's very flexible in the sense that it looks at the event, okay, well, you know what? This didn't really work out. We need to change things, right? And so they're very flexible and nimble in that regard. And I think in the West, many people don't realize this, right? They think that, oh, well, their system is not flexible. It's stale. It's rigid. It isn't at all. It's really quite flexible in that regard.
Yes, thank you for that analysis, Arin. And we have some interesting comments from our viewers in the chat. Our viewer, Corche, identifies the Chinese system as technocracy with Confucian characteristics, which is very interesting characterization. John H. writes that he believes that Chinese leaders after Mao realized that communism, or whatever they were doing would not enable China to match the material progress of capitalism or the West. Hence, they made this pivot. But I think the Communist Party has become more of a brand rather than an ideology. It's essentially the continuity of the ruling elite that wants to stay in power, of course, but they're willing to be pragmatic in order to keep that power. And if that means adopting elements that don't quite cohere with communist ideology, they're willing to do that. Now, Alan Crowley also points out that we also have a hybrid economy in the US. We still identify as capitalists, and here we signal right but turn left. And indeed, there has been an increasing amount of government intervention in the US economy. There are some ways in which the US economic system is more heavily bureaucratized than the Chinese system, at least in some respects. It may be more difficult to engage in certain kinds of entrepreneurial activity here as opposed to in China. And the reason isn't even necessarily that the central government is so overbearing, though it sometimes might be. It's because there's this patchwork of special interests and local community groups that makes it very difficult to get anything done in the United States. Try building a residential development in San Francisco, for instance, and you will see what I mean. But it's interesting that capitalism and communism have become more akin to labels rather than really opposite poles of any sort of spectrum anymore. And it's more a question of what pragmatic policies are pursued in different countries and different parts of the world. What are your thoughts on this, Arin?
Yes, those are great points indeed. And going back to Deng Xiaoping, I believe he also said once that, and again, I'll paraphrase him, but he said, listen, there's no point in arguing about stuff. Try it. If it works, keep doing it. Right. And so they're very pragmatic in that regard. And I think you brought up a good point, Janadi, with it being more of a brand, right? Rather than an ideology. Exactly. I mean, look, there definitely are some aspects in China that resemble communism. On the other hand, you're right. They've been very, very flexible in trying new things. And I believe there was a comment here in the chat by someone saying that, let's see, I think they were saying in terms of development, right? It's true. They realized that doing what had happened in the Soviet Union was not going to work for China, right? And I would invite everyone to go back there. There's a nice graphic circulating on the internet. Yes, that's it, by Luis Arroyo. Yes, they realized that communism, whatever they were doing, would not enable China to match the progress of the West. Absolutely right. Yes. And I would encourage you guys, there's a graphic circulating on the internet showing that I believe in the 1980s, okay, at one point, India's GDP was higher than China's. And since then, China has blown past India. And listen, I'm not knocking India. That's another country and a culture I love and I find fascinating. I love India too. But it's real interesting that since that point, China just basically blew past them. And India's catching up though, and they're really doing great, and so they're catching up too. But I think it's really interesting to look at that, right? And it just goes back to the amazing progress that has happened in China. And someone else said technocracy with Confucian characteristics. I love that. I'll use that, and I'll give you credit, right? And so that's one of the biggest takeaways today that I would want people this is one of the biggest takeaways I'd want people to have after today. Excellent. No matter what your opinions are about China, right? Whether it's positive or negative, right? Don't focus on communism and capitalism. Focus on progress. Focus on improvement. Focus on cooperation. I'm sure we'll get into more of this later in our chat, right? But that's one of the things I really want to drive home to people is let's see what we can learn from them, right? Keep an open mind. let's see what we can learn from other countries, especially in East Asia, whether it's China or it's Japan or it's South Korea. South Korea has had an amazing level of improvement over the last decades, right? South Korea has become an economic juggernaut as well. I believe South Korea has a larger GDP than all of Russia. That's pretty impressive, given how small a country South Korea is, right? So again, let's focus on what we can learn from different places and different cultures, right? We might have different systems, but it doesn't mean we can't learn from them.
Yes, absolutely. And this is why this conversation is so fascinating, because I think we can learn from societies where certain key policy decisions have been made in very different ways from the United States or Western Europe, with some significantly different outcomes. Now, it's also important to note that, yes, we need to avoid simplistic characterizations, and Francois Joanneau points out that one-word characterizations, capitalist, communist, whatever, are bound to be simplistic for being disconnected from realities. And reality can be a chaotic bureaucracy versus a chaotic oligarchy. The chaos seems to follow us no matter what systems or brands or labels we use, and how to overcome the chaos, I think, is a key challenge that we all have to face. Now, we have an interesting question from Jason Geringer, our legislative director, who asks, when comparing Western and Eastern cultures, is there a big connection to the fact that Eastern cultures have a much longer history compared to the West? And I think here he's primarily focused on the United States, because he writes, China's culture goes back thousands of years, yet the US has only a few hundred years of history. Of course, Western European cultures have a longer history with their Greco-Roman origins, for instance, and the Greco-Roman cultures were in turn influenced, say, by ancient Egypt or the Mycenaean Greeks, or to some extent the culture of Crete and the Minoans. But nonetheless, there are thousands of years of Chinese history and Japanese history, and it seems that history has had periods of prosperity and great power, also periods of relatively less prominence on the global stage, as in the 19th century for China and the early 19th century for Japan, of course. But then quite recently on the historical scale, beginning in the 1870s for Japan, and really in the late 1970s for China, there has been a resurgence for both of these countries. But how does the fact that they have a long history really influence any differences between their culture and, say, American culture?
Jason, that's a great question. Having studied Japanese and Chinese history a little bit, not a lot, there's such a wealth of history to study there. I would say that it really depends. Sometimes having that historical background, having all that history is a positive, whereas other times it may be a negative, right? One of the things I love about the U.S. is that the U.S. is in itself a startup of sorts, right? And overall a very successful one, right? And what happened in the U.S. that had never been done before, right? And so it's of course the history is important to study, and I do think that Chinese and Japanese and Koreans do derive a lot of benefits from their rich cultural background and history. On the other hand, it's not always positive. It's not a guarantee that it's positive, right? And again, there's people in those countries who have brought this up. Recently, I believe there was an interview with the Uniqlo founder, right? Uniqlo in Japan. And during which he was very critical of Japanese organizations. And he was saying basically that Japanese organizations need to be more nimble. They need to move away from this concept of nemawashi, the seniority, right? Automatic seniority based on age, right? And stuff like that. And so he's arguing that Japan needs to change, right? And what he's saying subtly is that, well, maybe Japan has to be a little bit less Japanese in its approach to business and startups, which is that's a controversial statement, but maybe being Japan's richest guy, I think he can say that without worrying about too much blowback, right? Because he's quite revered over there. So listen, I love the history, but it's not automatically going to be better, right? It depends on how you use your culture, how you use this historical background, right? But of course, it definitely does. It definitely has shaped the development of these countries. There's no question about it, right? But it really depends. It would be my answer.
It's interesting because I recall an experience back when I was in high school. I was on a field trip to the Japanese embassy in Chicago, and they had a kind of educational day. And I asked them a question along the lines of, what are the attitudes in contemporary Japan toward the Tokugawa shogunate? Because the Tokugawa shogunate ushered in a period of isolation, essentially, for 2 centuries in Japan. And now Japan is a very technologically advanced, globalized, economically prosperous country with a lot of international connections. So it seems the Tokugawa period was the diametrical opposite of what Japan is today. But how do Japanese people today perceive it? And the answer I got was essentially, if you think about how most Americans perceive, say, George Washington or the events of the American Revolution, it seems that most Americans think fairly little about them. And it's similar with most Japanese people. At least they perceived the Americans as thinking fairly little about their history. I don't know to what extent that's true necessarily. It does seem that the American Revolution still figures fairly prominently in political discussions in the US today. But it did seem to me that their answer was more along the lines of, most Japanese people are focused on the present, the more recent past. They don't really look back at that kind of earlier history as much. But what are your impressions when you visited Japan? Do you hear a lot of discussions of history, especially of past centuries?
That's a great question. Not really, no. And I think it's the same thing in China too. I mean, even though they have this rich historical background, and it's the same in South Korea as well, I'm sure. Even though they've got this rich historical background, and of course they do learn about their history in school, I'm just not sure that it's something that's on the top of people's minds on a daily basis, right? I don't think so. I think what's much more prevalent is the idea of being Japanese, or the idea of being Chinese, or the idea of being Korean, right? And what do I mean by that? It's certain cultural aspects. So, I just mentioned nemawashi, and things like senpai kohai, right? The manager and the subordinate, right? And stuff like that. And although these things might, if we're learning about them in the West, these things might have sort of a negative connotation. I would be careful to label these things, because there's a positive aspect too. We go back to the senpai and kohai, right? Manager and subordinate. Yes, it's true that the employee respects the manager, but the manager also helps the employee. It's a two-way street, right? It's not this one-way street of someone barking orders down to you, right? So I guess what I'd like to say is, it depends how you use it. It just, there's good and bad points to it, right? And I just go back to Deng Xiaoping saying, look, don't argue about it. Try it. If it works, if it's positive, keep doing it. If it's not, throw it out. And that's what I would urge our viewers to do, is learn about these cultures, learn about these countries, learn about how things are done in other places. And if you can use some of that in your own business and your own life, you should. And if you feel that you can't, well, then don't worry about it. right? And that's why I wrote my book Kaizen for Men, whereby we're basically using Toyota production system principles for self-improvement. You know, at first glance, you might think, how the hell are those related? You know, but you can use those tools, right? It's not limited to a production, a manufacturing facility, right? And I would say the same for various cultural aspects in East Asia, right? It need not be limited to them. Why couldn't we use some of this, right? And that's another that's something I'd want people to walk away with today, right? Learn about these cultures. Let's explore their rich cultural background and see what we can use in the West.
Yes, indeed. And I think one purpose of these salons is definitely to gather insights that could potentially be applied in our societies, but really in any society where people care about improving the human condition. Some feedback from our friend John H. He writes, I don't attribute much importance to any nations having long or short histories. I think the main thing any people's ever learned from history is that human beings don't learn much from history.
Brilliant.
Or perhaps it's
So
better
true.
to say we learn details about history, but they don't necessarily have much impact on decisions we make today because the cultural and political dynamics seem quite repetitive. And of course, I have wondered for a long time, how can we better harness the lessons of history so that we don't repeat the same mistakes? And we've had some fascinating feedback from our audience. I want to go to our panelists, and we've been joined by David Shoemaker, who is our Director of Applied Innovation. So David or Daniel, do you have any questions for Arin at this time? Let's see. Dan.
I could jump in with a comment or two. I've heard that it's kind of a maybe a trope or a cliche that the Asian or Oriental mind is fundamentally different from the Western mind. I think Alan Watts even said, in the West we have a noun verb noun style of thinking. Something is verbing on some other noun, whereas in the Asian mindset it's more Zen. You can just have a noun and a verb, expressing kind of a maybe a suchness or be like water, Bruce Lee kind of thing. So that's one thing I wonder if you could speak on. And the other is from a business perspective. Someone said, yeah, you can do business with China and it'll be great, but 9 times out of 10 it'll be great, but there'll be this like clockwork. 1 time out of 10 the deal will completely go haywire or sideways, or you'll get burned. So I don't know if those are just Western kind of chauvinistic thoughts, but do you have any can you corroborate or comment on those two positions?
Great points there, Dan. That is fascinating. Thanks for sharing that. I mean, at the end of the day, we're all human beings, right? And when we're born, at least I believe, we're a blank slate, right? And so a lot of it depends on where we grow up, right? And I think that, for example, had my parents not left Iran when I was born, I would be a different person today, right? And if Gennady, if you hadn't left Belarus, you'd be a different person today. And I'm not going to comment on better or worse, right? But so at the end of the day, we're all human beings, but a lot depends on one's personal development, where they grew up, and cultural factors and so forth. Now, you mentioned language, which is fascinating because Japanese and Korean grammar are far different from English grammar, right? The verbs at the end. Chinese grammar is actually more similar to our grammar. And Chinese grammar is really, really simple. It's shockingly simple, right? So in that regard, Chinese is easy to learn. On the other hand, then you have the tones, and the pronunciation is quite difficult for most Westerners. And then, of course, having tens of thousands of characters, Chinese characters to learn, that's kind of a roadblock, right? Then on the other hand, the Korean writing system is probably the easiest and most logical writing system in the world. It's really, you can learn it in a day probably, right? There's 20-something characters. So, yeah, so obviously the grammatical structure of these languages is different. Now, as to whether the East Asian mind is different, Is it? I mean, I don't know. I would say their education system is different for sure, and based on their cultural factors, they have a different way of thinking about things. They have a different way of perceiving things, right? Definitely, than we do. And then you go back to doing business. I think that in the West we're really focused on getting the deal, right? We're very focused about getting everything on the table and reaching a conclusion. Let's get the sale, right? And I realize that I'm a stereotype. It's kind of a stereotype too, right? But basically, we're focused on getting the sale, right? And it's not like that in a lot of different cultures. Of course, they're interested in getting the sale too, but they might spend more time on relationship building. They might spend more time on consensus building. When I mentioned namawashi, the consensus building in Japan, right? That takes time. That takes time, right? Or other cultural factors, like in Japan, they might say, "I'll think about it." Kangaete okimasu. Maybe it means no, right? Like when we say "I'll think about it," it pretty much does mean "I'll think about it," right? Whereas in some other cultures, "I'll think about it" doesn't really mean that. Maybe the deal's dead, but they're trying to find a way to break it to you that won't be hurtful to you, right? And so there's definitely those factors as well there.
Yes, very interesting indeed. Now let's go to David Shoemaker for his question.
Yeah, hi. By the way, good to see you. It's been a while, and
You too,
always
sir.
enjoy conversations with you.
Always good to see you.
One of the things I've been thinking about here in the West is the urban and rural divide, politically, musically, culturally. That's true in China as well, right? I mean, it's a different flavor. And maybe how's that different, or what's the Chinese government doing to try to bring that together? I think most of what we read about here in the West, when it says China, is we're talking about the great urban progress and so forth that's been made. So I don't know if you could just talk a little bit about that divide that they have. And like you say, maybe there's something there that we can learn to help us patch together our urban rural divide.
A great point there, David. Absolutely. Look, I think, and someone mentioned a comment saying that despite the fact that China has made great strides in alleviating extreme poverty, there's still a lot of people there who are or financially or economically are not doing as well as city dwellers, and that's unfortunate. And but I will tell you, I've traveled quite a bit in the Chinese countryside. And for the most part, they really do like their government because they've seen the palpable progress that has occurred over the last few decades. Now, has it been a completely smooth ride? Of course not, right? There's been mistakes made along the way, and they realize that. But the Chinese are very, very pragmatic, right? And they see the progress that has been made over the last few decades in lifting people out of extreme poverty. And most Americans, now there is poverty in the U.S. Of course, there's way more of it than there should be. But most Americans have no idea, at least most Americans who are alive today, have no idea of what it was like in China when the country was not doing well, right? And most people have no idea what it was like in Japan after the Second World War, right? Some people do, the military who were there stationed in Japan, definitely. But with that being said, David, I think there still is. I don't want to use the word divide, but there still might be. But on the other hand, I think that people in the Chinese countryside are mostly pretty optimistic about the direction of the country. Now, that's changed a little bit in the last couple of years, especially recently, right? I think there's been kind of a slowdown economically, but I would say that that's probably hurt people in cities more than people in the countryside, right? But again, with that being said, I think I do think though that the Chinese Communist Party is still quite popular, at least in the countryside. And in terms of is there something we can do here in the U.S. or here in the West? And I think that's just such a fascinating question. It's difficult, because I think you're right. There is. I don't want to use the term animosity, but I do think in the U.S. that things have become very polarized recently, right? Especially in the last few years, even much more so than before. I remember when I was a kid, in the 1980s, that, and I distinctly remember this, right? That even when people had differences of opinion, they would be more respectful of each other. Now maybe that's some function of social media and all this kind of stuff. Anyone can say whatever they want at any time, right? And there's good points about that. There's also bad points, but I do think that politically things have become there's just so much animosity here in the U.S. It's shocking, and whether it's someone who considers themselves to be on the left or the right, or it's and I want to say a lot of this happened. It wasn't always like this, right? And so I think things have become very, very polarized in recent years. I think that's kind of dangerous, right? And I think that whatever steps that we need to take to ensure that it becomes less polarized, I think we should do so. As to how do we do it, I really have no idea. That's not really my domain, right? But I would say to you that yes, I do see that happening, and maybe it's not just the U.S. I bet it's Europe too, right? And now you might say to me, is it the case in China or Japan or Korea? I would say not really. Not to the extent that it is here, right? And part of that goes back to, I think in East Asia, people just have a different relationship with their government than we do in the U.S. Now, there's good points about that, and there's bad points, right? And I'm not going to say the Chinese system will work in the U.S. It will not work in the U.S., right? And I'm not going to say the U.S. system, the American system, will work in China. It will not work in China. And that brings up something I wanted to discuss with everyone here. China and Japan and Korea are not Western, and they will never become Western, right? It's important to understand this. They might be using some Western technologies. Japanese people and Chinese people are wearing suits instead of traditional Japanese and Chinese and Korean attire. That doesn't mean that they're Westernized, right? And I think it's important to understand this. These countries are not Western. They will never become Western, and that's really important. Especially for those of us doing business over there, right? We really need to understand this.
Yes, this is all quite fascinating, and I share your concern about political polarization in the United States, which seems to be getting worse by the year. Mike Lazine points out his agreement that the situation has become much worse for politics in the US compared to the 1980s, and people like Donald Trump, who is definitely an inflammatory demagogue, have helped make it so. I would say, though, there are factions on the political left that have also inflamed hostilities, in part as a reaction to Trump adopting a lot of his tactics, which is very unfortunate. But there is a sense in which the polarization in the United States comes on gradually. It's a very powerful force, but we see it incrementally increasing from year to year. It seems like we're getting all of these warning signs. We're getting all of these signals that we need to do something different, that we could steer this Leviathan of the American political system in a different direction, and it's going to take hard work. But we, in the general public, still have some influence over that, I hope. With the Chinese system, my sense is there is this external veneer of stability and order, and of course the Communist Party is definitely a monopoly. It does not tolerate serious political competition. But on the other hand, there could be tensions boiling underneath the surface, as we saw with the zero COVID policy, which was extremely well adhered to. You could say it was extremely effective in terms of what the Chinese government sought to accomplish with it, which was to keep down COVID case counts, until all of a sudden it wasn't, until the frustration with it came to a boiling point, to the extent that I think the Communist Party was afraid of outright revolution by millions of people. And they had to very quickly pull back the zero COVID policy. And it seems that even in a society which is characterized as being authoritarian, like China under Xi Jinping, it's still the case that the people can influence events. It's just that you don't see it until it's about to hit an explosive level of tension. Is that also your impression about what might be happening under the surface in Chinese society?
Janari, those are great. Those are great observations. Yes, so I will say the Chinese government cares very much what the people think, even if that's not communicated in Western media. And look, the zero COVID is a great example. In the beginning, right, when COVID wasn't as contagious, they were doing a great job. COVID numbers were down. People were able to roam freely, whereas in the West, I think we were struggling quite a bit. I think things took a turn when with the various variants of COVID, where it became more contagious, and thus it was more difficult to control it that way, right? And yes, I do believe it was a scenario in which the populace basically said, look, don't go too far, right? And so I do think, look, I think the Communist Party has a very good pulse on the will of the people, right? And as you said, it very quickly made changes, right? Probably thinking, listen, this isn't working anymore. We have to change this up. So that's why I go back to saying that they're very flexible, right? It became clear that that policy was not working anymore. They changed it, right? And when I was there this summer, mind you, I hadn't been back since the last time I'd been there was December 2019, just before COVID arrived. And when I went back this summer, it was very interesting. It seemed like all remnants of zero COVID were gone. All of those, the testing stations, all that stuff was gone. It felt exactly as it felt when I was there in 2019, right? So that was really interesting, right? But I think you're right. And again, it just goes back to, I think Chinese people have a different relationship with their government than people in Western countries do, right? And again, there's a lot of people in the West who, and I'm reading some of the comments here. Fair enough. I think a lot of people in the West would be uncomfortable living in such a system. I can tell you, living for 5 years in China, I loved living over there. There's a lot of aspects of China that I love. There's aspects of it I don't love, right? And so it's just going to depend on your values and how you would like to structure your life, right? And I think that's one of the benefits of living in this day and age, is where we have options, right? It's much easier now to be an expat than it was, say, 200 years ago, right? And so there are more options for us. I think the world is becoming closer in the sense that it's easier to learn about other countries and other cultures than it was before, right?
Yes, indeed. And I have long been an advocate of cosmopolitanism, of an outlook that sees oneself as a citizen of the universe, more so than having allegiance to any particular nation state. Because I think ultimately we all, as human beings, even if we have different cultures, even if we have different values, we still live in the same reality. And we still have many of the same fundamental biological and material interests, as well as the ability to cooperate productively using applied rationality, which is, I think, what all people in all countries should embrace for the sake of world peace and prosperity and mutual understanding. At the same time, of course, there are significant differences that we need to keep in mind and take into account when we approach other societies. And instead of simply dismissing everything that is different from what we are used to or what we consider to be the best way to do things, we need to consider, well, how can these alternatives contribute to our understanding of the world and our sense of what is possible? Now, what's interesting is you mentioned how quickly it was possible to change in China from a zero COVID policy to essentially no precautions. And it does seem that in more authoritarian or top-down societies, it is easier to change certain levers of policy, for instance. And if a decision is made to change them, that decision could be implemented more quickly. And I think this has relevance for transhumanism. Our friend Mike Lazine wonders, would transhumanism advance faster under an autocracy than a democracy if the leadership decided to advance it faster? I do think there would be less resistance from special interest groups. There wouldn't be community activists picketing research facilities, for example, or if somebody wanted to build a new city. Well, the Chinese government has constructed many new cities, not all of them successful, but they could do it more quickly. So from the standpoint of the transhumanist vision of the future of humanity, where technology is applied much more thoroughly to solve fundamental human problems, do you think there's a possibility for a more authoritarian East Asian society to actually get there sooner than a Western society? Or do you think that we still have advantages because of our greater respect for individual rights, individual initiative and autonomy, and the right to be different? We have more businesses that are kind of on the cutting edge of technological innovation in the United States, for example. Do you think those advantages overwhelm the speed of policy changes that could be possible in a more authoritarian system?
That's a great question. You know, I would say not necessarily, right? Because look, I mean, let's just say that North Korea decides to become more technologically advanced. I'm just not convinced that they could do it better than China or the U.S. or some other country, right? So not necessarily. You're right, Gennady, that in systems that have more. I hesitate to use terms like autocratic because labels like that, I don't know if they're very helpful, but I see what you guys are saying. It is true there may be less resistance, right, to getting things done. There'll be less NIMBYism for sure, right? But that brings up an interesting example. I read an article the other day. I don't remember which publication it was. Basically, the gentleman who wrote it was arguing that Japan has solved the affordable housing crisis due to their flexible zoning laws, right? And that's totally true. That's totally true, right? The kind of NIMBYism that exists in San Francisco does not exist in Tokyo, with the consequence being that someone could have a minimum wage job in Tokyo and afford their own living space. I very much doubt you could do that in San Francisco or New York City, right? But Japan is not a country where we would think that it's autocratic, right? So I guess my answer to the question would be not necessarily. Now, there would be certain things that might go easier or smoother because there would be less resistance, but it's not an absolute guarantee, right, that would be the case. And a great example of this is if we compare the US and Japan. The US has a much more vibrant startup scene than Japan, much more so, right? If you're starting a startup, the US is a way better place to be than Japan, right? And then similarly, if you're starting a startup, China's a much better place to be than Japan. There's a huge wave of entrepreneurialism. sweeping through China, especially women entrepreneurs. It's amazing. It's breathtaking. I love seeing it every time I'm there, right? So I don't necessarily think it's whether a place is autocratic versus not. I do think it's a function of where the resources are allocated in that society and what's really important to them. But credit to Japan, the Japanese government has they're very aware of that fact, and they're making changes. Now, those changes might not happen as fast as we would like them to happen, but they are happening, right? I believe that there's a new startup visa going into effect next year, 2024, whereby startup founders can get a visa to live in Japan for 2 years, right? And so things are changing.
Yes, that is quite interesting. And I do think that Western societies have a lot in their favor as well, particularly from the standpoint of this culture of individualism and individual empowerment. And it seems that on a smaller scale in Chinese society, this tradition of entrepreneurship is also being established, though it has existed for a long time on that kind of small scale. If you think of the many street vendors in Chinese markets, for instance, and those have existed for millennia, essentially. But taking that to a larger scale, allowing entrepreneurs to play a role in shaping what the Chinese Communist Party certainly would consider to be economic policy, the direction of the major productive efforts in a society. That, I think, is still a path that China is on and would need to utilize more effectively in order to be able to realize some of those great forthcoming technological leaps. Now, another interesting cultural difference is the attitude toward family. And Daniel Tweet points this out. In many Asian cultures, it's not uncommon to have 3 or more generations living under the same roof. And he wonders, is this from a long heritage of mutual support? And I will also venture to say, I come from an intermediate culture in this regard. It's not as heavily family-centric as Chinese or other East Asian countries, but it's also not like the American culture, where in many cases, at least in some parts of the country, young people literally get kicked out of the house when they're 18. And they're told, well, you're a legal adult, now fend for yourself. This would be unheard of in Russian culture unless there was some sort of war or famine or the parents couldn't support the children. Indeed, in Russian society, by necessity, families have become very tight-knit. And many times in the Soviet Union, multiple generations did live under the same roof because there was only so much housing to go around, and they were assigned essentially a particular apartment. But even afterward, there is still a much longer time period of family support. And the idea is young people gradually gain this kind of autonomy and eventually reciprocate with support for their parents as their parents age. But nobody gets kicked out of the house. Sometimes people leave the house on their own. But in Chinese society, it seems, and in Japanese society as well, there's an even greater reverence for one's elders and this much more continuous relationship of support and multiple generations living under the same roof, the true extended family. So how would you characterize the differences yourself in terms of what you've seen and in terms of how that affects the broader society and behaviors within it and economic opportunity? Because I will hasten to say, it is very hard in the United States to be a young person without family support, especially now that housing has become so expensive, essentially, unless you have family money or unless you bought your house during the Great Recession, as I did. If you're a young person, you cannot buy a house in the United States right now. But if you have family support in a country like China, you might still live fairly well, even if you're not earning a high income. So how would you compare and contrast these various approaches?
Great points there, Gennady. Thank you so much. And I, like you, come from an intermediate culture, being Armenian from Iran. There's this, it would be unthinkable, right, for us to kick out the kids and after they turn unthinkable. It's not right. And in fact, our parents were I lived at home until I was 26, and I loved it, and my parents loved it, and it was really great. With that being said, I think you're right about China, especially China, right? And now it's interesting in China, in Chinese, when they ask you which country you're from, the Chinese characters for country is two characters. Country in China is guo jia. Guo is country, jia is home, right? So the second Chinese character for country is home, house, right? And so I think that really reveals a lot about Chinese culture. I've always said China is a family country. It really is. Much more so than Japan, much more so than Korea, right? It's hands down the best country in the world if you're for having, if you have a family. It really is. The love I've received from my in-laws it's indescribable. Okay. And so the concept of family is very strong in China. And this goes back to Confucianism, this idea of one of the aspects of it is this filial piety, right? And it's Chinese people, for the most part, they take care of their parents when their parents become older. And now part of that is because China doesn't have, China it doesn't have such welfare systems as you see in Western Europe, right? It does not. So that's one of the reasons. But the other reason is because culturally, that's how it's always been, right? This idea that, especially if a family has one son, well, the son is going to be taking care of those parents. It's kind of like an unwritten rule. And so, but look, for some of us in the West, we wouldn't be comfortable with that. I can tell you that I would. I became, it's true I'm from an intermediate culture, but I would say after having lived in East Asia, especially China, I would say I'm now closer to that culture in terms of how I view a family. If my kids want to stay living with me for longer, I'd love that, frankly, right? And but you're right. It plays a very, very, very important role in East Asian societies. Part of that is because of historically, right? Especially countries like China, they don't have a welfare system that exists in Europe or even the U.S., right? And so that's one of the reasons. But I do think the biggest reason is culturally, right? And but in terms of, I guess the question was, do you have many generations living under one roof? Not really, not in cities. Not in big cities, because it's tough to do that, right? If you're living in a 100 square meter apartment, 1,000 square foot apartment, it's going to be difficult to do that, right? Additionally, there have been rapid changes taking place in East Asia, in particular. People are not really having kids anymore. East Asia is probably the lowest birth rate in the world, right? And other countries, of course, like Spain, like Italy as well. But definitely, if you look at the birth rate in South Korea, it's super, super low. It's super, super low. And there's a number of reasons for that, right? But so on some level, it might be possible in the future, right, for people to live with their parents because no one's really having kids anymore. So I hope that answers that question.
Yes, I think that was a very insightful answer. And we have some feedback from our audience as well. Mike Lazine points out with minorities in the US, there are those who also take care of their elders, and various white Americans in the US have done the same. John H. points out that in the US, many families have their members spread all over the place, hundreds and thousands of miles apart. And he thinks this was a far less common familial feature in the past, even in the US. And we do live in a world where people are very mobile because of employment prospects or opportunities or necessity if they're specialized in a particular field and there are only so many jobs and the jobs are geographically concentrated, then they would have to move if they want to experience a certain boost in their income. Now, the prospect of remote work changes that a bit and perhaps gives people more flexibility, but then a lot of people are still not certain about how sustainable that is. There has been a lot of corporate pushback against remote work, unfortunately, in my view, but we will see whether that becomes a longer lasting phenomenon. I hope it does, that would enable a bit more geographic flexibility and people staying closer to their biological families. But I wanted to follow up with you on this observation of declining birth rates in East Asian countries. And Japan, of course, has one of the lowest. Japan has an actively decreasing population, and I believe South Korea is close. And China had the one-child policy, which really damaged it in terms of its population growth. And now it doesn't have the one-child policy, but it does still seem to have very low reproduction rates. And it doesn't seem to be for the same reasons as in Western countries. That is to say, a lot of people in Western countries make the conscious choice not to have children, and it's more of a lifestyle preference that they have. Whereas, as you mentioned, in East Asian countries, there is a heavy focus on family. And there is more social conservatism even as well, I would say. But the birth rates there are lower than they are in many Western countries. So what would explain this seemingly paradoxical observation?
Right, that's a great question, Gennady. I think it's a function of several factors. One being also the high cost of housing in countries like China and South Korea, combined with the stress of putting a kid through school, right? For those of you who have kids here, if they're complaining about school, you should take them to South Korea or Japan or China and see what sort of rigorous study those kids are put through. And school here is Disneyland compared to that, frankly. Now, I think there's issues with that, right? I think probably East Asia, they push too much, and here and in the West, probably not enough, right? I think we should probably try to aim for something in the middle. Anyway, I think Gennady, it's a function of several factors. It's the high cost of housing. It's the stress of putting kids through school. Additionally, in countries like China, it's extremely difficult to get into university. It's not like in the U.S. Now, you might say, well, it's difficult to get into UCLA or Harvard. Well, of course it is, but it's not as difficult to get into university here as it is in China, right? And the entrance exams there, the Gaokao, it's really, really brutal. It's a meat grinder of a situation, right? And that these kids are put through in order to get in. You've got to take an exam to get into a good middle school, then you've got to take an exam to get into a good high school, and so forth, right? And so that's another one of the factors. And another factor is, and when I've been speaking with Japanese people, is that in over there, if a woman does have a job, she's still expected also to do this stuff at home when she gets home. So it's these expectations that haven't, from the past, that haven't really changed. We're in a different world right now, right, in terms of that. So it may be some factors like that as well. But you're right. By and large, East Asians are not having kids. I think this is very, very disturbing. And the South Korean government has tried things such as giving tax credits, giving money. That hasn't helped at all. That hasn't helped at all whatsoever. It hasn't helped at all. And so I think that governments need to get a better focus on what's driving this, and to really look for better solutions.
Yes, it is a fascinating set of considerations, and John H. points out this is part of the reason why so much effort is put into robotics in Japan. Someone or something has to take care of the growing elderly population, Mike Lazine points out there's a high cost of housing here in the US as well, but it depends on where you are living, and there is a trade-off. Essentially, there is this economic trade-off when one decides to have children. And historically, the incentives were more aligned because if you were in an agricultural society, more children meant more help on the farm. And you could get them to work fairly quickly. By 6 years old, they could do some rudimentary work around the house, maybe a little bit in the field. And by 13 or 14, they were definitely productive helpers. Whereas now, if you're raising a child, you have to put them through school, through college. If you want them to really become financially independent, you also have to consider the cost of housing. And as I mentioned, for young people in the US, housing is increasingly out of reach. It may be more so in East Asian countries, especially in dense city centers. So these are all challenges to deal with. Now, of course, one important way to overcome those challenges is to keep the people who are alive now around longer and in a youthful state. That's what we transhumanists advocate. And I wonder, during your conversations with residents in China and Japan, have you encountered any interest in technological life extension, in rejuvenating the elderly, in increasing maximum lifespans, in part to solve some of these problems, but in part because it's also good for the individual?
Absolutely, yes, Gennady. Absolutely, yes, I have. And based on my own very, very limited experience and research, I think that you'll probably find more support for technologies such as gene editing in East Asia than you would in the U.S. I really believe so, right? And furthermore, I think part of the reason why that might be is just given this super hyper competitive environment in Chinese schools, right? And but also the Chinese startup scene. It's super competitive. It's a level of competition I think most viewers here have never seen. So I think that might be what's driving that too, right? Now it's true there is no more one-child policy, but most Chinese people are either having no kids or one kid. So if you only have one kid, wouldn't you want to do everything in your power to make sure your kid will succeed? And hey, one of the ways we could do that is through gene editing. Right? Controversial statement, I'm not right, but we should think about that. If you only have one kid and you'd like to make sure he or she succeeds and beats everyone else, you'd like to give them a step up, right? And so that's probably what's driving part of that. But I think too, Confucianism itself is super pragmatic. It's not ideological at all. Well, it is a little bit, but not really, right? You could be a Confucianist and a Christian. You could be a Confucianist and an atheist. You could be a Confucianist and Buddhist. There's no reason why you couldn't. It's super flexible, right? Super pragmatic, right? So I think that's what's driving that too, right? And then in having lived in countries like China and Japan, yes, they've got great infrastructure. Now, there's aspects of I mean, look, financial payments, digital payment technology. China's way ahead of everyone else, right? It isn't even close, right? On the other hand, I think Japan is not as advanced in that area, right? So I think it's important to look into these various factors. But I do believe, Gennady, that based on my own limited experience, that the average person in China or Japan would be very open to these technologies, right? Especially if you could demonstrate that it's going to help them get a leg up on the competition, or it's going to help improve their quality of life, right? And the other thing is, which I have to discuss, which is controversial to some people, but look, countries like China and Japan are not as religious as countries like the US. That might be what's driving some of that, right? And I'm not going to comment on religion itself or the benefits or disadvantages. I'm just saying that if perhaps if someone is very, very religious, they may be more opposed to the CRISPR and gene editing and this kind of stuff. Not necessarily, but I'm just throwing it out there. So that might be driving some of that as well.
Yes, that is quite fascinating. And it does seem to me that there are fewer moral reservations in China or in Japan or in South Korea with regard to technological means of enhancing humans. For instance, in Japanese culture, even robots are not seen as anything unnatural or scary. They're seen as part of the natural world, in essence. There's not that hard distinction between technology and nature that exists in many traditional Western points of view. And also, it seems that, yes, because of the greater pragmatism, there are fewer hangups about, well, should we really do this? Is this playing God, etc.? And most of the considerations are practical in nature. Like, is this going to work? Is this going to solve some problems? Which I think fundamentally is a healthier way of looking at it. At the same time, I have not seen a lot of explicit movements that self-identify as transhumanist out of China or out of Japan. And what I have been wondering is this just due to a communication gap? Is it that these movements do exist, but they primarily communicate amongst themselves because these are different cultures and they use different social media platforms, and they are more comfortable with communicating with those who are like them, just as all people are to a certain extent? Or is there a fundamentally different approach toward social movements? Are people perhaps afraid to be part of an explicit movement, even if they have individual attitudes that would align with it, because they don't want to stir up too much trouble? They think, well, the Communist Party might take an issue with an explicitly transhumanist movement, or in Japan, perhaps it would be making too many waves. The Japanese society tends to be a little bit more focused, or a lot more focused, on kind of this presentation of extreme respectability. In the United States, a lot of people really don't care if they're respectable. Now, I, for one, do. I think it's important to present oneself in a respectable way. And I think it's possible to do that while still being intellectually sometimes divergent from the mainstream society. But it does seem to me there are these facets of East Asian cultures which really place an emphasis on the appearance of respectability and even conventionality, to the extent that might deter some people from being very open about unconventional ideas. But what do you think is the reason why we have so much more explicit transhumanism in the West, it seems to us, even though based on the cultural traditions of the West, there are also more sources of resistance and severe moral opposition?
Janadi, that's an excellent question. I think part of it, honestly, is we've done a poor job of marketing this amazing movement in other regions, and then the other thing is too. Yes, I do think one of the things that's helped move transhumanism more forward in the West is perhaps the fact that we're maybe a more individualistic society, right? And that there's been such charismatic people such as Huxley or Max Moore, Natasha Vita-Moore, and so forth. These groundbreaking individuals, right? But I think there's no reason why this movement couldn't also be popular in East Asia, right? Even with their less individualistic culture, right? Even with a more consensus-building culture. Wouldn't it be great if we got a whole bunch of transhumanists together from all over the world in East Asia so we could build consensus together? Building consensus is better than building nothing at all, right? And so I think part of it is that we just, it's not really been marketed over there. They're not any sort of great transhumanist works in terms of maybe writing, or maybe there are, and we've missed it because we don't read Chinese and Japanese, or my Chinese and Japanese skills are not quite up to par, I have to admit, despite years of study. And so that's probably what's driving part of that as well. You mentioned the social aspects. I do think that plays a role, but at the same time, it depends on how we market it, honestly, right? And so to take Japan as an example, you mentioned there's robots there, and yes, this is going to become more and more necessary because Japan is a rapidly aging society. So I think the more we can do to ensure that the elderly remain healthy and vibrant well into old age is going to be huge. It's going to really help their society, right? Now, whether we do it through medicine, I would rather do it through scientific breakthroughs as opposed to building more robots. Because with building robots, you're not actually solving the problem, right? You're not actually helping elderly people live a more vibrant life, right? It's the robots are there because there's not enough workers to take care of them, right? But if we were to ensure that the elderly remained very active and vibrant and strong and healthy well into the later years, that would be amazing, right? And that's one of the things that transhumanism promises, right? And the same thing would go, and the same thing it would be helpful in China too, right? Especially given the fact that so many young people are taking care of their parents, right? The way we could position it is as, look, I really respect the fact that you're taking care of your parents. Wouldn't you want your parents to live a more vibrant and healthy and active life, right? And of course they would want that. Anyone would want that, right? So I just think the challenge is the way that we're promoting the message, right? And frankly, there has to be more transhumanist works. There's got to be more transhumanist oriented companies, right? And we have to come out and boldly state our objectives, right? That's what we need in the transhumanist community, is for people to come out and boldly state our objectives, and in an unwavering fashion, right? And because the things that transhumanism focuses on and promises is special, right? The elderly are a treasure. We should do a better job of taking care of the elderly, especially in Western societies. To go back to this thing, right? I think it's deplorable the way, the attitude that many people take toward the elderly. This is very sad. The elderly are a treasure. We should protect them at all costs, right? And so I want to get away from this kind of thinking that says that, oh well, the elderly are a burden. This is very, very sad. And one of the ways we can combat this is through transhumanism, through scientific breakthroughs, which are going to allow people to live longer, healthier, more vibrant lives. And frankly, I don't think that there's a movement better than transhumanism in order to accomplish this. We should come out and boldly state our objectives and then accomplish them.
Yes, thank you very much for that answer, Arin. And I think it's quite promising that we can, in your view, boldly state our objectives and get far with East Asian audiences in terms of building these bridges, building support for transhumanism, and cultivating movements in those countries, which I think are going to be very much aligned with a lot of the preferences and a lot of the behaviors that the residents of those countries already pursue. There's a great perspective from Peter Wong, who is officially the U.S. Transhumanist Party ambassador in China. This article is called "The Development of Transhumanism in China." And Peter Wong wrote this shortly before the COVID pandemic. And after the COVID pandemic, we kind of fell out of contact with him, but it would be useful to rekindle that contact. In the meantime, I would encourage everyone to read this article for a Chinese perspective on both the prospects and the limitations of the transhumanist movement in China. Certainly, the explicit transhumanist movement there is much smaller than it is in Western countries, at least as Peter has perceived it. However, as Corshey points out, Chinese culture has a long history of pursuing life extension rooted in philosophies like Taoism. And there is another dimension, of course, and that is the aesthetic dimension. And Mike Lezine points out there are plenty of transhumanist works for art that are coming out of Asia. There's a lot of sci-fi and fantasy art that can be pointed to. And Mike Lezine himself is a fan of East Asian science fiction and fantasy art. He points out there are a lot of great computer graphics, visual artists coming out of East Asian countries. And to some extent, your favorite game, which is Deus Ex Human Revolution, it has a component that is very strongly inspired by East Asian culture and business and architecture. So I was curious if you could talk about this aesthetic dimension and how it contributes to an implicitly transhumanist view of the world in Japan and China and other East Asian countries.
Yeah, great points there by Mike. Definitely, I would urge everyone who hasn't been to Tokyo to go there and go to the Shinjuku district of Tokyo with its the buildings and the neon lights and so forth. It looks really quite cool. And every time I'm in Tokyo, I definitely go there. It's my favorite neighborhood, probably. We just go around there and just marvel at everything over there. But yes, this background that you see here this is from Deus Ex Human Revolution. And yes, there is a part of that game that takes place in China. I love it. I can't tell you the number of times I've played and beaten this game. But anyway, so yes, in terms of transhumanist architecture and art, yeah, there's a fair bit of that in East Asia. Well, whether it's Tokyo or whether it's whether it's Chongqing in China or wherever else, Seoul, Korea has that as well, of course. So you do definitely see that, and I think that the cityscapes there are maybe more suitable for this, for lack of a better term, being dense cities and that have a high population, and so they need to house a lot of people using a small area of land, and so it's maybe not realistic for everyone to have a 10,000 square foot lot and white picket fence and 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, right? And so a part of it is they're cityscapes by necessity, right? Whenever you have so many people crammed into a small space, and Hong Kong's a great example, definitely too. So I think that's definitely that's one of the reasons, right? And then the other thing is too that there's a lot of great companies coming out of East Asia now, not just in the obvious ones, right? Toyota and so forth. But there's a lot of great biotech companies too in East Asia, and then there's a lot of great AI companies, right? And I believe there was one of the comments that was discussing AI and quantum computing. Chinese startups are very, very strong in this space, right? They're very, very, very strong in this space, but not just in this space. I would urge everyone to visit China and to take a look at the numerous electric vehicles on the streets of Chinese cities. A few years ago, Tesla was the undisputed king, and not anymore. Chinese people, by and large, are preferring to purchase Chinese electric vehicles. They have better functionality at a better price. And so I think that's one of the reasons why Tesla has been forced to lower their prices due to this competition from Chinese brands. So I would urge everyone to visit East Asian cities and to take a look at these technologies, right? But at the same time, it doesn't mean that they're ahead in all areas. That is not the case. I still think that not to make it a competition or anything, but I do think that the U.S. still has better biotech companies, and furthermore, for whatever reason, people in Japan still love to use the fax machine. So that's and things like fax machine and like a personal stamp and stuff like that. So that there are those aspects as well. But so I would urge everyone to head over to this region, and whether you go to Japan or whether you go to China or whether you go to South Korea and so forth, go over there, see what you can pick up, see what you can learn, right? That's one of the points I would like to drive home today is let's see what we can learn from each other, right? It should be it should be a healthy cooperation to see how we can join forces to battle the real enemies, right, of poverty, environmental degradation, disease, and so forth.
Yes, indeed. And I completely agree with you that those are the real enemies of us all. And we need to cease these interhuman rivalries in order to focus on defeating the forces of ruin, death, disease, decay, poverty, scarcity. All of those need to go. And we transhumanists need to defeat them. Now, David, you have a question for Arin, so please go ahead.
Yeah, this comes about with the comment about the lower electric vehicle costs in China. I have some friends that live about an hour north of me that are educators, and they're retired now, but they spent a good share of their adult life in China in the education system there as Westerners, helping setting up schools and westernize some of the education that's there. One of the things I came away with from discussions with them is I picked up on this idea that while everybody wants to put on a good face, in China, there seems to be an extra special attribute to that. The way buildings are built, they have to look polished, and sometimes that overtakes functionality. I think this trend we see in the Chinese space program with their launches and their their space station. I think we see it possibly also in their auto market, where they get special help from the government so that they can look good selling a product that is domestic at a better cost than something that has to be imported, like you comment from Tesla. So I'm wondering if you've seen that too, and if that's valid.
Yeah, David, great point there. Yeah, I think honestly one of the challenges of building a society and building an economy in a short period of time, right? That's one of the challenges there, right? In order to be able to go from where China was in the late 70s to where it is now, extraordinary development, right? That didn't come without issues or challenges, right? And so it may manifest itself in scenarios such that maybe this project has to be built, and it has to be built within this period of time, and these funds all have to be used up, and so forth. I think that was certainly the case in Japan, whereby localities or small towns would receive funding, and they'd have to use all of it, right? And so the consequence of it is seeing, basically almost all rivers in Japan are concreted, and that's not actually a verb, but I think you know what that means. But so yes, that's one of the growing pains of an economy that has to get built up in a short period of time. You had another interesting point on subsidies. Yes, I believe that's very much the case, right? But I will tell you, it's not a guarantee that Chinese and Japanese will support local brands. Apple's hugely popular in China, right? They love foreign brands. Foreign brands are sexy, Apple, David Beckham, and so forth, right? And so, so for the longest time, Chinese people much preferred a foreign brand over a local one. I think that's changing somewhat, especially with Huawei and the amazing, the Huawei just came out with a new phone, I think the Mate 60, and it's selling like hotcakes over there because it's a great product, right? And so I do think that they traditionally they've loved foreign products. I also do think that they're very pragmatic, and if a local brand comes up with a better product, I think that they'll support it. So
yes, indeed. And it's interesting too that there is sometimes a trade-off between speed of advancement and safety, as Jason pointed out, you could have a situation where a society is advancing so rapidly, especially if it's trying to catch up, where there could be some issues with safety or with quality. But that's actually where Toyota then introduced its great innovations in Japan, ultimately leading to Japanese vehicles being safer than American vehicles for at least a period of time and in certain respects. But say in the 1980s, you probably would have been better off being in a Toyota than in a GM vehicle if you were in an accident. And John H. also points out that robust but ultimately friendly competition works best. And the example that you provided of Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers essentially leading to an impetus for Tesla to lower its prices is a case in point. John H. also writes, Americans need effective competition. After we beat the USSR to the moon, it felt like the pressure to win was off and we got a bit slack. If it had kept on, we would have been on Mars in the 1980s. Yes, I think it was a tragedy that the space race essentially subsided, because it seems both societies turned inward in the early 1970s. And I think one of the reasons was the Soviet economy had already started encountering serious trouble. So they really couldn't sustain a significant expansion of their space program, though obviously they tried to keep up the space program for prestige purposes. And in the United States, there came about a perception that, oh, we beat the Soviets to the moon, the war or the competition is over, essentially, and we won. And it's unfortunate, actually, that this perception came to be, because obviously there was more to develop in space for goals that would have helped people in both the US and the USSR. Now, Mike Lazine wonders, where are Japan and China in terms of autonomous vehicles? So electric vehicles are one aspect where a robust but friendly competition can help. Autonomous vehicles would seem to be another aspect, especially because, again, there might be less of a moral reservation in regard to them. In the United States, there does seem to be a segment of the population that fundamentally just doesn't really like change of any sort. And manually driven vehicles are familiar, but there's also this American mythos of kind of the open road, and if you're the driver, you're in control of your destiny, etc. And I don't really share that view at all. I would rather have the convenience of not having to drive. I could still pick my destination and I would be fine. But if other drivers were a lot safer, and the only way they would be significantly safer is if they were automaton, I would be a lot happier about being on the road. So I wonder whether you are aware of any significant innovations in the realm of autonomous vehicles coming out of either China or Japan.
That's a great question. And by the way, I'm really loving the comments here. Mike, Francois, and everyone else. Thank you, Matt. Thank you so much. Just keep bringing the comments, because I think everyone here is making such great points. Thank you for that. Now, in terms of autonomous vehicles, I would say that China's definitely ahead of Japan in that area. As far as what I've seen, there's entire fleets of vehicles, the taxis being electric, and and then one interesting aspect is, in Chinese cities like Shanghai, where the government's trying to control the number of cars on the road. If you want to buy a car, you need to get the license plate. The license plate's pretty expensive. It's like $10,000 or something like that. And what they've done now is said, okay, if it's an electric car, you get the license plate for free. So what's happened in Shanghai now? A ton of electric vehicles. I would say probably 1 out of every 3, probably even more. I was so surprised. I hadn't gone back in 4 years, and then going back and seeing these changes, right? And so I think China's made a more progress on the autonomous vehicle front than Japan. But look, I'm like you, Gennady. I'd rather not have to worry about driving, and especially where I live in Los Angeles, the traffic being as horrific as it is, it makes me never want to be in a car at all. But if I am in a car, I'd like to just sit back and do my own stuff, maybe get some work done, maybe have a cup of coffee and or two, and let the car take me to my destination. That can't come soon enough, But I do think that a lot of people are, change is not entirely comfortable, right? For us human beings, we're running antiquated software, right? Our external environment has changed, but our software hasn't. We need to upgrade our software. One of the ways to do that is through transhumanism.
Yes, absolutely. And transhumanism comes in many forms. One of those would be human augmentation or curing diseases, lengthening lifespans, but another form is through external technology, and autonomous vehicles are definitely a manifestation of transhumanism. And I also want to thank our friend John H. for his generous support. He writes, another energizing salon thanks to our guest hosts and chatty audience. And indeed, we've had some great audience engagement here. We have also some good words from our friend Cyrus Matara, who writes, this is so fascinating. Thank you so much for going live. And indeed, we've had a lot of viewers who have been fascinated by this discussion. Now, this is a question that brings in the thoughts of a popular geopolitical analyst in the US, Peter Zeihan. So Jason wonders what you think of Peter Zeihan's claims about China and its future. And my understanding is Peter Zeihan thinks that China is on the way down as a superpower because it's going to run into some economic growth constraints, population constraints because of the legacies of the one-child policy, as well as the low fertility rate that you've mentioned. And essentially, he thinks that from a resource standpoint, from a population standpoint, the US is in a much better shape. What do you think about this? Do you think China is actually peaking, or do you think it has a long growth trajectory ahead of it?
That's a great question. I must admit, I'm not very familiar. I know who Peter Zeihan is. I'm just not very familiar with his work, unfortunately. But it is true that China does have a lot of challenges now, especially just like Japan, just like South Korea. It has a rapidly aging population. Resource-wise, China is a country that needs a lot of resources in order to continue its development, right? And comparatively, if you look at the U.S., yes, I think the U.S. is in a much better position in terms of population growth. Is definitely in a better position vis-a-vis resources, right? I think no one can argue that. With that being said, though, we've been hearing about this for decades. China's impending collapse, doom and gloom, end of the world, World War III, World War IV, and so forth. And people have been predicting China's fall for decades, and they've continued to be wrong. Might they be right at some point in the future? Sure, but as Jared Diamond has discussed, it's possible for any society to collapse, right? I don't think we should focus on that. Rather we should think about how everyone in the world can improve, whether it's the U.S. or whether it's China or whether it's Djibouti, right? And so, but to answer the question, I'm not a fortune teller. I don't hold the cards of the future. If I did, we might be in a different situation here, right? Than we currently are. So I do. So while I do think China has a lot of challenges, you have to understand this is a country that survived so much upheaval, right? There's invasion by the Japanese, invasion by German, invasion by British, Americans, so forth. There's a great leap forward. It's Cultural Revolution. and each time they've come back stronger. I think one of the things that I really do respect about East Asian cultures, and I'm not saying that Western cultures don't have this, but one of the things I really respect about East Asian cultures is their fortitude. They have an amazing amount of fortitude, right? And look at all this stuff that these people have overcome. Japan was destroyed after World War II. The U.S. has never had that happen to it, right? And so I think in a sense these horrible events that have happened in East Asia, not recently but in the past, really helped the populace build fortitude and discipline and willpower in order to overcome these tragedies, right? And and someone in the comments, someone here in the chat made comments that after the fall of the USSR, maybe in the US that we took our foot off the gas pedal. Probably we did on some level, right? But yet it's understandable why that would have been the case, right? If you look at after World War II, Japan was destroyed, Germany was destroyed, Western Europe was basically destroyed. The Chinese and Indian economies were in the dark ages. Who else was there? There was the US. That's it, pretty much, right? And then, of course, after the fall of the USSR, there was only one superpower. That was the US, right? And now with the rise of China, do I think Peter Zeihan is right that China won't be a superpower? He's absolutely 100% wrong. China already is a superpower, and we have to accept this, and we have to do whatever possible to avoid further confrontation with China and other countries. So someone posted in the chat that this recent meeting between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden was a very welcome step in the right direction. I absolutely agree. We have to continue with the dialogue. We have to continue with the cooperation, right? There's no reason why we can't have healthy competition in terms of building our economies and companies. Absolutely. But I think we have to do whatever is in our power to avoid war. No war of any kind, not just a conventional war, but no trade war either. The trade war was idiotic and has at least in part contributed to this nasty inflation that we're seeing in the U.S. and other countries. It was very, very ill advised. It was idiotic. We have to avoid doing this.
Yes, I absolutely agree that avoiding war, both physical war, a hot war, or an economic war, or a cold war, would be paramount. And Jason writes, China is dependent on trade and imports food and energy. And indeed, it seems to me that a lot of Chinese policy up through the mid-2010s has been to make the world so interdependent that any severance of trade with China would hurt all parties to that decision to such an extent that governments, policymakers would be reluctant to go there. Unfortunately, it seems that a lot of nationalism, jingoism, protectionist economic thinking, which I think is highly fallacious, have taken hold in many Western countries in recent years. And it's not just Donald Trump, though. Donald Trump definitely manifested this kind of hostility. The Biden administration has continued to pursue a very staunchly anti-China policy, and it seems there was no real difference between Donald Trump and Joe Biden in terms of their approaches to China. And I am much more of an internationalist in terms of trade. I will say I support globalization because I do. I think there are great benefits to specialization and comparative advantage, and utilizing those, of course, I do think a country should have productive capacity available in case of supply chain disruptions, but that's not to say that we should always be autarkic. And there are great success stories. Hong Kong, for instance, which was essentially a barren island, but because of its extensive trade connections and a policy of free trade, free enterprise that was pursued under the British administration. And then for about 20 years after Hong Kong was transferred to China, there was a kind of benign neglect by the Chinese authorities. Unfortunately, that's not the case anymore. But during that time period, Hong Kong prospered and became one of the wealthiest regions of the world per capita, even though it started out as a barren island with essentially no natural resources. Corchet writes, China is fast-tracking nuclear power exactly because of its dependence on coal and petroleum imports. So there could be an impetus for technological innovation there. But I agree that just because an entity is a net importer of certain kinds of resources does not mean that entity is not a superpower, does not mean that entity is not a major economic player or will continue to be. The US is a net importer of a lot of goods, and we would have been far worse off had that not been the case. So I do wonder, in regard to your thoughts about what some of the most productive methods would be to ensure peace between China and the United States, because there has been a lot of saber rattling, particularly over Taiwan. And my view is, of course, Taiwan should have autonomy because obviously any group of people, any jurisdiction where people do not want to be subject to the control of another government or organized force should have the right not to be. And Taiwan is, of course, very important to the world economy. It is the world's leading manufacturer of semiconductor chips. And if Taiwan were to have any sort of disruption, any sort of invasion, any sort of interruption to its productive capabilities, the entire world would suffer. All of the digital economy that we have built would grind to a standstill, unfortunately. So we want to avoid any sort of military confrontation in Taiwan from whatever source. But on the other hand, it is no good for the Biden administration to be threatening China with war if tensions were to escalate over Taiwan. So how could we maintain peace so that there's no war with China, and at the same time Taiwan remains autonomous, and to the extent that its people do not want to be part of mainland China, they do not have to be?
Yeah, great questions there, Gennady. And I would just like to state for the record that I'm firmly, like you, I'm like everyone else here, I'm sure, I'm firmly against any kind of war, whether it's a conventional war, it's a trade war, whatever it might be. I'm firmly 100% opposed to any sort of war. And now in terms of how we can improve the relationships, look, it's going to be tough. It's going to be a challenge, you know, just based on all the really stupid policies by the U.S. government in the last number of years. You know, it's true, Trump started the idiocy, but the Biden administration has continued the idiocy. Right, and so it's going to take some time to repair these relationships. And I think this continuous dialogue is very, very important, and continuous cooperation on matters that are important. Now, look, if it's going to be cooperating on climate change, and that's how we're going to start it, I'm all in favor of it. Right, I'm all in favor of it. However we can continue cooperating with each other, I think that's the most important thing. If climate change is what does it, then I'm all in favor of it. If it's biotech, I'm even more in favor of it, right? And so we have to continue the dialogue, we have to continue the cooperation and increase the cooperation, right? And make sensible decisions that are going to positively benefit each population, right? And the trade war didn't really do that, right? That was certainly a step in the wrong direction, and so is all this saber rattling, right? This is not positive. This is not healthy. Now, in terms of the East Asia region, look, it's very clear that the biggest player in East Asia is China. That's it. Very simple. The U.S. has to recognize that you know, the U.S. is not in a position where it can play the policeman, play the world's policeman. This has to stop, right? And so and then in the case of Taiwan. Look, I think that's an internal discussion between Taiwan and China, right? I don't think it's healthy for the U.S. to be involved in other countries' political affairs. And you spoke about semiconductors. So So there's a large number of Chinese companies, semiconductor companies that are improving. SMIC is one of them. And furthermore, it's not just them, it's Samsung too, right? So Taiwan isn't the only player in town, right? And even though it does have an amazing semiconductor industry, it's not a scenario in which everything is static, right? And in other countries, they're not going to step up to the task, right? As I mentioned Samsung, I mentioned SMIC. Look, people were doubting what SMIC would be able to do in a number of years, and I think they've done that. The latest Huawei phone, I believe the components in there are over. I don't remember the exact percentage of components that were Chinese made, but it was most of them, right? And I think a lot of people didn't really expect that, right? And so I think that the more development there is in this regard, the more sort of interdependence of economies and companies that occurs. I think that's going to decrease the likelihood of war, hopefully.
Yes, I hope so. And certainly, again, competition, diversification, all of those are influences in the directions of prosperity and peace. And there was a bit of a discussion of, let's say, energy independence, the Chinese efforts to become less dependent on oil imports. And to some extent, the US had become less dependent on oil imports as well for a variety of reasons. One is the US has more domestic oil resources now, and furthermore, solar power has advanced to a great extent over the past decade. But that means that there's less of a reliance on one particular source, on one particular place. And there's always a vulnerability when you only have one option. But I do hope that anything that happens with regard to Taiwan or the situation between the US and China can stay on this level of economic arrangements and beneficial economic competition. So if China wants to cultivate a semiconductor industry on its mainland, or other countries that are more aligned with the US wish to do that, I think that could be beneficial in defusing the tensions. Likewise, between Taiwan and China, I would hope that there could be some peaceful economic ties that eventually render the question of whether China would invade Taiwan obsolete, because just as China tries to interconnect itself with the rest of the world via trade, what if China and Taiwan became so interconnected via trade that a war would seem quite counterproductive to all players involved, and there would be more of like a confederation between them, perhaps. Maybe not explicitly, but in the course of a few generations, the leadership of both countries will decide, oh, I guess we're both kind of China, and we both kind of have legitimacy. And I think they're pragmatic enough to do that. In the United States, or in Western cultures, it would be very difficult without explicitly resolving the question of who is independent, who is sovereign. But I feel like the Chinese culture is pragmatic enough that they might just be able to somehow make it make sense for them. Do you think that's a possibility, like in 50, 60 years? On all sides, they will say, oh, I guess we're all kind of sort of China now, without really either set of ruling elites overthrowing the other?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think, though, going back to interdependence of economies, look, that I would say most Taiwanese companies have a presence in mainland China, right? And so they're already very interconnected, right? And so that's been great. And then there's been the resumption of flights between the two countries, and so I think that's really positive. Now, as to your question of what might happen, let's say 50 to 60 years later, I do think that they're very pragmatic, and you're right. It may very well be a scenario in which, well, this is how it's developed. Okay, I think this is working out really well for us, right? As opposed to having this like, oh, well, I need closure on this, right? And I think you bring up a good point. I think a lot of people in the West it's sort of this ambiguity bothers them, right? Really. it really does bother them. Whereas I don't think it bothers East Asians as much, right? And because I think we're really in the West are really focused on black and white, right? Whereas it's probably more nuanced in East Asia. I know it's a stereotype, but I've certainly found that to be the case.
Yes, indeed. I recall the famous saying by Deng Xiaoping, it doesn't matter if the cat is white or black as long as it catches mice.
Exactly. Great example.
Yes, indeed. And we have some great feedback from our audience as well. First, Mike Lazine points out that Sophia the robot came from Hong Kong. And of course, I've seen Sophia in person. We also had a great Virtual Enlightenment Salon with David Hansen, the creator of Sophia. And indeed, the legal environment of Hong Kong allowed him to pursue a very ambitious enterprise in robotics. And it's unclear whether he would have been able to take the same paths to developing his robots like Sophia and Han and Grace if he were bound by the restrictions in the United States. John H. writes, the U.S. is also responding to the anxieties of Asian allies like Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, etc., with its China containment or restraint efforts because those allies fear Chinese dominance. John's advice for China is just to wait Taiwan out. He thinks that eventually, especially if China moves a bit more in the direction of liberty, Taiwan may not object to be a Chinese province. And generally, my view is forcing confrontation is bad. You don't want to do that. And again, this is not a culturally American view. It is more of a view of being okay with nuance and ambiguity or the passage of time, taking care of a situation rather than trying to solve it right now, perhaps to the detriment of future opportunities for solutions. But at the same time, there is right now a fairly significant risk of escalation, and I think all sides need to work toward diffusing the tensions. Now, I'm curious, since you've had experience in both Japan and China, how would you characterize the relative perceptions of one another in those societies? What are the predominant views of Japan and China, and what are the predominant views of China and Japan?
Great question there. Yeah, thanks for that, Gennady. I should also point out that I've also lived in Taipei, Taiwan, so I'm somewhat familiar with that area as well. So it's complicated. To answer your question, it's complicated, right? Obviously Japan has that history where they invaded China and killed millions of people, and also South Korea and also Thailand, and so in that aspect, Japan is viewed very negatively in East Asia. On the other hand, I think Japan has a lot of cultural items that people in other East Asian countries love, right? The manga, the anime, and all this kind of stuff. And Japanese companies, they have a good reputation. Their products have a very good reputation, right? And so that also exists. So it's complicated. Now, in terms of how China is portrayed in amongst its neighbors, I think the recent, not just the zero COVID, but just the recent sort of discussions that have been taking place and various events that have occurred, hasn't helped. It hasn't helped the Chinese government, right, in that regard. So that's one challenge, right? I think the historical aspect of it is it's important for us to recognize that, right? And given the history between Japan and South Korea and China, right? And so that's still a very sensitive topic, right? What happened in Nanjing and obviously Japan in invading China. On the other hand, if we're going to study history, we should study history in its totality, specifically that for many, many, many centuries, Japan and China had a very good relationship with each other. There's no reason why that couldn't continue. There's no reason why there has to be hostility, right? And so I think a lot of people recognize that as well, right? And so I don't believe it's a scenario in which there has to be continued hostility or anxiety, right? And furthermore, I do think that as China becomes more powerful, I think that naturally countries in the region will start gravitating toward China as a kind of, I don't like to say this, but like big brother, right? Right. I think that'll be a natural movement toward that. Now, that's no guarantee. There's no guarantee that that will happen, right? It's going to take constant dialogue and communication and cooperation amongst these countries, and that's why I think the ASEAN was a really good move in that regard, right? And I think that if there continues to be such movements, I think that's going to be very beneficial for the region as a whole. So look, I don't think any one scenario is a guarantee. I think when I say we, I mean East Asian countries and the world as a large has to work together to make these scenarios happen.
Yes, indeed. And hopefully this kind of cooperation will become more likely with the passage of time, especially if the voices of peace prevail in all of the countries involved, and we can each influence our respective governments to engage in less saber rattling. Matt Richards writes, it's good that finally some people open their eyes and stop the narrative of China bad, USA good. We need a mondial cooperation and hopefully proper technological progress. And again, it is about solving the shared problems that we humans face. Now, Daniel, you had an interesting observation about AGI and quantum computing dominance. There does seem to be a bit of a race toward that right now. So you asked about what Arin would think would be the general result of that competition. Perhaps you might want to set the stage for your question a bit more.
Well, I think at some point they announced their intention to become the dominant player in those fields, and I salute their pragmatism. You know, I hope that we can have this global brotherhood based on this kind of pragmatic spirit that they've evolved through such a long history and culture. But Arin, did you have any comments about if they're the right country to achieve that dominance in the light of their pragmatic stance toward the world?
Yeah, Daniel, great question. I mean, honestly, I would hope that the world becomes dominant together in leveraging these technologies for the betterment of humanity. But, you know, as to which country will, I don't know, you say win the, I never like to use that terminology. I mean, look, it's no guarantee. It's really no guarantee, right? Going back to my previous point, I think it's going to depend a lot on what we focus on, what we focus our collective efforts on, right? And of course that, you know, as part of this whole Chinese rejuvenation, that's one of the areas that they have singled out. I think that's ultimately great. And I would urge, you know, that obviously the U.S. is very much involved in this, but it shouldn't just be the U.S. and China. How about other countries, right? I think everyone needs to step up in this area, right? It can't just be that the U.S. and China are going to duke it out and then other countries are going to sit on the sideline. I'm not saying that's what's occurring. I'm saying that shouldn't occur, right? And it's going to be beneficial for the world if everyone improves in this area, amongst other areas, right? So you know, as for who achieves dominance, I would hope that the world as a whole achieves dominance in this area, right? And there's no reason why that can't be the case, right? You might accuse me of being too idealistic, but I really do believe it's going to be to the benefit of the world as a whole if the world as a whole improves, right? We should be lifting all boats and not only some of them.
Well, I got to ask about you know, at APEC, Biden called China a dictatorship. You know, is it a dictatorship, and was that a gaffe? I mean, they have the trappings of a republic and of neighborhood level councils that go all the way up to you know, the higher echelons of government. But I don't know. Do you think they are functionally a dictatorship, or if they are, should we be calling them that?
Yeah, that was a very unfortunate, very ill-advised statement. And you know, of course, I don't agree with that at all. and it was actually rather really poor timing. These sorts of things are only going to hurt the relationship between the two countries. Again, I think a lot of people are focused on semantics. They're focused on words. Oh, communist versus capitalist. Dictatorship versus, I don't know, the democracy. This is not helpful. This is really not helpful. China's not the enemy. Who the real enemies are things such as poverty, environmental degradation, aging, disease. We need to be coalescing to fight the real enemies for the betterment of humanity. And so I think it's not very helpful to take this sort of position, right, of making such statements. It's really, really not helpful.
And I'm a big fan of like seasteading. Do you think, which countries in Asia do you think are likely to embrace the ocean as a frontier for human habitation? Any initial thoughts?
You had me at seasteading. I'm a huge proponent of seasteading, absolutely, and I think it's going to have multiple benefits, not just environmentally, but also too in terms of alleviating this housing affordability problem, which is a real big problem in a lot of places. It really is, especially since COVID, it's become one of the biggest topics, and rightfully so. And I'm a huge proponent of seasteading. It's going to help us in a lot of areas. Now, as for which country is going to be maybe the most, I don't know, the best place for us to achieve that, I don't really know. I'm not sure about that. I do know that there's been discussions with, there was what was that? Somewhere in Polynesia, somewhere in the South Pacific. I think that the Seasteading Institute were in discussions there with and apologies, I can't remember exactly who that was with.
Was that Tuvalu, maybe? The small island. There's a lot of small islands that are going underwater pretty quick.
It may have been, yeah. I'm not. I don't remember it at the moment. But look, I'd be happy for it to happen anywhere. Look, here in the Gulf of Mexico, just near Houston, Texas, the number of abandoned oil rigs that are there, we could start there. That's somewhere where we could start. Right, and these abandoned structures that are sitting there, they could be put to use, right? Obviously, there's going to be challenges with that, right, with hurricanes and rising water levels and so forth. But because of rising water levels, I do think that seasteading is something we should consider, definitely. And
we need to undo some of the thermal sink that the oceans have become. We can actually do ocean thermal energy conversion, cool off the oceans and generate power. I think that's like the win-win solution for energy and environmental remediation. But I'll get off my soapbox now.
No, I love it. OTEC is something I love too. Absolutely. Yes, we should. This is a vast, untapped area where we really do. It would really behoove us to explore this deeper.
Indeed. And there is a lot of promise in seasteading. Of course, we in the U.S. Transhumanist Party explicitly support seasteading initiatives, and we've had guests, for instance, Michael Elliott and William Ote, who are both interested in seasteading. The project in French Polynesia that was referenced is called the Floating City Project. Unfortunately, it did not succeed, and this site from the Seasteading Institute states that in 2017, the Floating City Project in French Polynesia gained a lot of momentum when the Seasteading Institute signed a memorandum of understanding with the government of French Polynesia, and the entity called Blue Frontiers was formed to develop the project. During the election that year, a small minority of French Polynesians spread misinformation about the project to discredit the president, Edouard Fritsch. And despite the apparent opposition, the president easily won re-election. Unfortunately, the political fighting did cause the floating island project to be postponed indefinitely. A major crash in cryptocurrency that year did not help, and remaining funds for the project were returned. So that is quite unfortunate. but there has been this pattern of political risk essentially derailing otherwise promising seasteading initiatives. Now, I wanted to ask you, Arin, in regard to the experience of Chinese immigrants to Western countries and how perhaps their mindsets might be changed by being in the West, especially if they're first generation Chinese immigrants, but they often come to the US to study. They often excel in academic disciplines, and some of them stay. Some of them still maintain connections to China. Some of them may go back to China. But given the substantial differences in cultural outlooks, what do you think that this process of essentially immigration and connections between the Chinese immigrant community to mainland China, what effects would that have on potential cultural transformation or communication of different cultural values? And in terms of those Chinese immigrants who choose to make their home in Western countries, how much of an influence do they still have on what happens in China and the direction that Chinese society and politics could take in the coming years?
That's a great question, Gennady. I think that Chinese immigrants are well positioned to succeed in societies like the U.S., Australia, Canada, not just because of the meat grinder that they're put through in the Chinese school system. to coming over here, school here must be a piece of cake, right? And so I think bringing that work ethic, that discipline, and being in an environment, in countries like the U.S. and Australia and so forth, where your hard work is rewarded, right? And many Chinese people I've spoken with who are now living in the West, that's one thing they really like, right? They like this sort of dynamism that we have here in the U.S. And the opportunity to build something, right? So they do like that. I think they're well positioned to succeed over here. And a lot of them I've spoken to they still very much love China. That's their home country. It's funny. A number of Chinese people I've spoken with, even though they're living here in the U.S., they've told me that at some point they plan on going back to China to retire over there, right? So they do very much love their country for sure. Now, as for how much influence overseas Chinese could make on events back home in China, I'm just not sure about that. I'm not sure unless now they were to go back, and I think that it's true that a large number of Chinese who choose to come and study in the U.S. stay in the U.S., but it's also true that a large number of them end up going back to China, right? And so I do always believe that you can make more of a difference if you're there on the ground as opposed to not, and that's the case no matter which country we're speaking about.
Yes, and those are interesting observations. Thank you. Now, in Japan, the situation is a bit different. There is some Japanese immigration to Western countries, not as much as immigration from China, but in Japanese culture, there's a very stark delineation between Japanese and foreigners, essentially. Even today, if you weren't born in Japan and you moved to Japan and you spend decades of your life in Japan, you're still a foreigner. You're always going to be a foreigner. And you might be tolerated or treated fairly generously, but you will never be of that society. And one observation that I have is this does not help with their demographic crisis, because in the United States, for instance, people within the, let's say, long-established populations in the U.S. are also having fewer children, but there's enough immigration into the U.S. to still maintain net population growth. In Japan, there's net population decline. But what do you think about the prospects for Japan to perhaps become more interconnected with the rest of the world. Obviously, they already are through trade, but in terms
Right.
of population and cultural exchange in a way that could help them with their demographic crisis as well.
Great points there. And look, you're right. Now, you could, if you're not ethnically Japanese, if you move to Japan, live there for decades, master the language, so on and so forth, get Japanese citizenship, it's that's true. In the eyes of a lot of people, you're never going to be Japanese, right? It's this whole ware Nihonjin, aspect. Now, it is what it is, and I'm not going to say if it's good or if it's bad. But you're right that they do have a sort of a demographic challenge. I think that's changing, though, slowly but surely. It's Japan; it'll change, but it'll take some time. Last time I was there, at the airport, at my hotel, it was fascinating. I was just checking in, and I heard someone say in Japanese, "Welcome," hotel staff saying "Welcome." They're super polite. I love that about them, right? Saying "Welcome" and all this other beautiful, polite, lovely talk. And but I just remember thinking to myself, she has a bit of an accent, and I turn around and it's this Caucasian girl. I don't know where she was from, maybe she was, I don't know. I'm guessing she was Eastern European. I just don't know. But it was delightful to see that, right? And so you're seeing, especially in the service industry, you're seeing a lot more non-Japanese, right? In the past, you would see you would see a lot of Chinese in those positions. I think as China's become more economically prosperous, you're just not seeing that anymore, but you are seeing it from other countries. So it's not that the Japanese government doesn't realize that they have a demographics problem. They're working on it. It's changing slowly but surely. And so I think one of the ways that that's going to happen is through immigration. And then, as I mentioned earlier in our discussion, the new startup visa, which is going to be taking place next year, right? So things are changing there slowly but surely. It's gonna take some time, but it's gonna take some time. It's kind of the same thing in China, but I think though that look, obviously it doesn't matter how long I live in China, I'm not going to be considered to be Chinese, but I think they're maybe a little bit more flexible in that regard, right? And this is due to various historical and cultural developments, right? But with that being said, I do think that the East Asian countries, they're going to need to do something, and they're going to need to do it quickly. Now, whether it's people having a bunch of kids, which I don't think is going to happen. So what I think is more likely to happen is for there to be some more immigration from other countries. And so I suspect that we'll see more of that.
Yes, immigration and transhumanism as well. So one observation that has been made in regard to Confucianism by our viewer Korshe is Confucianism places immense importance on education, and this is a great similarity with transhumanism as well as humanism, of course. So do you foresee the emergence of a kind of Confucian transhumanism, particularly because Confucianism is not a religion, it's compatible with other philosophies, other worldviews? Could you have a kind of Confucian transhumanism, which is in some ways traditional in regard to views of family, for instance, or an individual's societal obligations, but also embraces science and technology and leverages this focus on education that already exists?
Absolutely. You had me at transhumanism, and then you had me at Confucianism, two things I feel very strongly about. Yes, look, there's no reason why we couldn't. They're not mutually exclusive, right? They're not mutually exclusive at all. As someone pointed out in the chat, Confucian societies place a lot of importance on education, and as you know, education is one of the ways in which we can advance, in our in any society, right? So I see no reason why the two couldn't be entirely compatible. It just may very well be more of a marketing thing. We've got to figure out how to better promote ourselves in Confucian societies, and I think that once we do, I think a lot of people are going to be on board with it. Why not, right? Why not? Especially considering the challenges that we're seeing in this region with the demographic problems, and then also resource scarcity, because China, Japan, and South Korea, they're not countries that are known for their vast amounts of natural resources, right? So anytime we can do more with less, I'm in favor of that, and I think that transhumanism and science and technology would be well placed to help these various countries with these challenges.
Yes, thank you for that response. And indeed, it does seem that science and technology will provide many of the solutions here. So I think we've come to the point in our salon where we will go to closing comments or questions from our panel. And really, at this point, it would be Daniel Tweed who will ask perhaps one more question or make an observation, and then Arin, it will be time for your closing remarks. So Daniel, please go ahead.
Well, I'd really like to make the whole seasteading proposition a big feature of this campaign cycle in 2024. Actually, I think every watershed in the world should actually be designing its digital twin oceanic going version. After all, we are a water planet, and that's an appropriate way to increase freedom and humane rights, as we need to upgrade human rights to humane rights. But yeah, I loved hearing your perspectives on Asia travel, and I just think it would be really cool to visit the Shinjuku district, maybe through telepresence. If someone could start a business where you could put on like a VR helmet and go explore that district of Tokyo, I think there's a possible business opportunity there that I couldn't afford the real trip, but I would sign up for a little VR experience like that. So anyway, thanks again for coming, and I will yield the floor.
Dan, you'd be surprised how affordable it is to go to Japan now, especially with the exchange rate. The US dollar is 150 yen to the dollar. It's never been this cheap. You'd be surprised how affordable it is to go. So I would, obviously doing the VR thing, I would love to do that. But the real thing is even better.
All right, excellent. And I hope to visit myself someday. It would be a fascinating experience. Now, Arin, what would you like to say as your closing statement for this conversation? What final thoughts would you offer our audience?
Thanks, Gennady. I'd like to thank everyone, firstly, for being here with us today on a Sunday. You could have been somewhere else. You could have been spending time with your family. You could have been doing something else, but instead you chose to be here with us. And that really means a lot to me. And I know it means a lot to the team as well, Gennady and Dan and everyone else. So I'd like to thank everyone for being here. And I'm very humbled and honored and to be here, to have an opportunity to speak. And it's just been such a great pleasure. Love the comments too in the chat. Really, really love them. You guys they're just solid gold in these comments. So thanks for that. And my closing words would be this. I would urge everyone, whether you're American or French or German, doesn't matter where you're from, I would urge you to visit East Asia if you can, or if you can't visit, to learn more about it, the history, the culture, the technological innovations, right? And to get a better understanding of this region, because I think that by and large, East Asians have a much better understanding of the West than the West has of East Asia. This is not good. We should have a better mutual understanding, right? And furthermore, this is one of the ways in which we'll be able to help improve the human condition, right? One of the core tenets of transhumanism is to help improve the human condition. What better way to help improve the human condition than by studying East Asia and its various contributions to humanity and the world, and seeing how we can leverage some of this to help our societies, right? Whether it's cultural aspects or whether it's technological aspects, right? So don't argue if it's about whether it's right or wrong. Try it, right? To paraphrase Deng Xiaoping, try it. If it works, keep doing it, right? And there's certainly no harm in trying to get a better understanding of East Asian countries and how they've developed over the years, and what are some of the things that they're doing that we could do. And I think in the end, it's going to be this virtual cycle of helping improve relations for all of us in the world.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much, Arin, and I hope our conversation today will help promote this virtual cycle and cultivate the kind of understanding that you have described. So I really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you to Daniel and David and Jason, and to our excellent audience as well. And I hope that we all live long and prosper.